Hello everybody, this is the environmental science content video for Unit 3, Section 3. We're going to talk about how ecosystems change over time, and we're specifically going to be looking at the communities of species that live there. And so that means not just plants and animals, but also bacteria and fungi and all the things we don't really think about. We will also be talking about rocks versus dirt and a few other things. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the big, huge overarching concept for this is succession and evolution. So, succession is talking about how the environment itself can change over a long period of time. This is specifically hundreds of years for primary succession. And primary succession is when we're talking about starting with bare rock, no living things at all, no dirt, nothing. This could be bedrock. It could be after a nuclear reaction or explosion where everything is completely wiped off the face of the earth, and the dirt itself has been drained of nutrients for some reason. Generally, this is talking about like if you're in a desert or if you are in a place where a bulldozer has like completely come through and removed all of the topsoil and it's just bare rocks. Right, so the first thing that happens is pioneer species move in. Pioneer species are pioneers. That means they move in first. So it's kind of redundant to say that pioneer species move in first, but that's what we're going with. So lichens and bacteria and some funguses, though generally not funguses, are going to move in first, and they will break down rock into dirt. Right, they're actually able to process the minerals off of rocks and break them up, and through erosion and weathering, we're able to have a little bit of dirt. That dirt then can hold small plants and lichens as well. So we're talking about ferns and very, very small plants. Like most of them aren't going to be flowering, but some could be. As the dirt continues to break down, grasses can move in. Small perennials can move in. Remember that perennials are able to come back year after year, as well as annuals that can do that. So we're going to continually seeing more complex organisms move in. All right. Generally, we're talking about plants because we're dealing with soil and the environment, not animals and the ecosystem. So after pioneer species move in, then we have something called intermediate species. So inter is between, mediate, middle, so in the middle species. So these are after pioneer species. So we're going to have taller grasses, some shrubs, some trees that need direct sunlight, such as pines is the good example there. And we have a increase in elevation of the plants as well. So they're getting bigger and taller. As they do that, they start to provide shade in that area, and because of that, we need plants that can grow in the shade. So the shrubs may change, and we're going to have more shade-tolerant trees like oaks, hickories, and maples, depending on how north you are. But these make up what's called a climax community. Climax means it's the end in this case, right? It's not like climax of the story where all the good stuff's happening and then we have something that comes after it. Climax is the end of our succession progress here. Notice on this chart slash graph, it's kind of on one of those graphical models that's between the two. You can see the depth of dirt changes and increases as time progresses, and that the roots of the plants that live there can go deeper and deeper and spread wider to get those nutrients that are in the dirt. Right? So say we have all this happen, and then a really, really big fire comes through, like the ones that California and much of the West has been experiencing this year. And I'm sure if we continue to watch this video year after year, that will continue to happen based on some trends that are going on. Then we're going to have something called secondary succession. Now, secondary succession means that there's already dirt that's been made and kind of acts as a foundation for other things to grow in. All right. So after primary succession has already occurred, then we can have secondary succession. We're still going to have pioneer species and then intermediate species and then climax communities, but it's going to take less time. Plants will start to grow back within 1 to 2 years. Then we're going to move from annuals to grasses and perennials like wildflowers in just 3 to 4 years. So by 5 years out, we're starting to have trees and shrubs, all right? Moving up to 100 into the hundreds of years, then we're in the climax community, right? But that's still less than 200 years, whereas our previous one, and I'm going to go back a slide, we had hundreds of years for each one sometimes, all right? So this is a very slow process with primary succession. Secondary succession is much faster, all right? And that's because a foundation, a starting material has already been made, right? There's already nutrients in the dirt. There's already a healthy environment. It's just that the top part has been cleared off, right? And I do want you to note that you can actually see evidence of large forest fires in the dirt. So if you look in this black line, that's actually something we can see if we dig up and take like core samples of the ground instead of core samples of a tree or maybe even a glacier. We can see the evidence of something that's gone on before, right? In this case, it'd be a fire. This is a big fire though, so this is killing all of the plants and trees that live in the area. Right? The other half of this is evolution. So evolution is how the animal species change over time. It also technically covers plants and bacteria if we go widespread, but I'm mainly focusing us in narrowly into the animal portion here because that's mainly what we care about. So evolution, there are a couple vocab terms I want you to get. So natural selection is what goes on without human interference, and it's due to an unequal survival. That means some specific individuals survive and are able to reproduce because they have certain traits, right? And because they are able to reproduce, they have kids who also have those traits. And those kids reproduce and so on and so forth. So there's more and more population that have that trait or that don't have that trait. And it all depends on something called evolutionary pressures. Depending on where you're looking, this also may be called selection pressures. I know when I was growing up and learning this stuff, they called it selection pressures. And selection pressures are just what's going on in the environment that might make it a good thing or a bad thing to have certain particular traits. All right, and you can look at the environment itself, the food supply, the predators that are around, the weather for these pressures. All right, so let's say it's starting to get really, really cold in part of the environment that this population lives in. So say it's, I don't know, a deer population that has moved north because they've eaten the food supply where they used to live. Well, as you move north in the northern hemisphere, it gets colder, right? So a particular trait that might be beneficial, a good thing for that deer is a thicker, heavier fur coat, right? And I'm not talking about, this kind of thing. I'm talking about the hair and fur on them, right? So a more cold tolerant deer will be able to live longer and reproduce more. So their kids, the next generation down, it's more likely that they will have that same thick, heavier fur coat. And this continues for generations, right? And then we have a difference between something like a caribou or a reindeer and a white-tailed deer that lives here in Ohio versus some of the deer and antelope that live closer to the equator, that have a thinner fur and they aren't as cold tolerant, right? So that's just one example, right? If, however, we look at things that humans have made an impact on, that have these are called artificial selections. So this would be something that humans have said yes to this, no to that. How does this balance out? And it's kind of like selective breeding in dogs, right? We've got a bunch of different kinds of dogs. My dog looks different than a lot of other dogs. We've got pugs, we've got huskies, we've got German shepherds, all sorts of different dogs, right? Those all come from the common ancestor of a wolf. Most of them don't look like wolves, though, unless they're huskies or malamutes, which look a little bit more like a wolf than, say, a chihuahua, right? So these dogs have been bred for specific traits or to not have certain traits, and this is artificial selection. All right. The other one I want to talk about is GMO crops. Genetically modified organisms is what GMO stands for. And the really easy one to talk about, especially here in Ohio, is corn. The corn that we grow today is of a couple of different varieties. One of them is meant for fuel, to make ethanol or to make alcohol out of it. The other is for eating, so it's a sweet corn. All right. Both those corns look very different than the corn that, say, the settlers in the 1700s and 1600s found in the Americas. It looks very different because humans have selectively bred these plants to have certain traits, right? In the plants that we see now that are grown, they are resistant to specific chemicals like insecticides, so that we can spray insecticides on a crop and kill the non-beneficial insects without harming the plants themselves. They also may be resistant to something like Roundup that kills plants so that they don't compete for the nutrients in the ground that the crop has, weeds, right? The other thing there is that some, not just plants, but some species are resistant to this mutation that humans are trying to get to happen. And this is called resistance, right? So it's the ability of one or more organisms to tolerate a particular chemical designed to kill it. So this is a chemical resistance. And we've bred this into a lot of GMO crops, right? It's not just corn, that's just the easy one to get to. Now, there is a big controversy between GMO crops and things like organic growth. You could have an organically grown GMO crop. Those are different things. And right now, at least in the US, the FDA is very loose on what makes something organic, but we are also not labeling things as GMO or non-GMO specifically. And it's not a bad thing to be genetically modified. We are continually genetically modifying a lot of crops to make them produce more fruits, to make them produce larger vegetables, to make them more nutritious. There's something called golden rice that is being used now that wasn't around 30, 40 years ago. And a lot of cultures around the world use rice as their primary cereal grain, right? It's instead of wheat, they grow rice, or they grow both and they eat more rice than they do wheat. So the rice, however, is not very nutritious. There's not a lot of good value in it aside from straight calorie intake. Golden rice has has more nutrients in it, so it's healthier to eat. It's still grown the exact same way. It's a little bit more resistant to drought, so it doesn't require as much water to grow, but it is a good thing. It helps, especially people in third world countries that don't have access to all the fruits and vegetables and foodstuffs that you might find at your local grocery store, right? So whether artificial selection is a good or a bad thing is up to opinion in a lot of people. However, I want you to know that I think it's a pretty good thing. Also, I love my dog, right? So ecosystems change over time through primary succession and secondary succession, as well as the evolution of the populations that live in them, right? If you're in my environmental science class, we are going to continue to go over these things and we're going to kind of look at them in a couple of different lights as well. So we're going to continue to expand on these. If you have questions, though, make sure you bring them up in the questions and I just forgot the name of my own assignment. The questions and reflections forum. Send me an email. Drop by my office hours. We can talk about this stuff, right? I am here to help you. Use your resources. Till then, have a good one.